All right, so now we get into the answer that God gives to Job. We just read through Job 38, and as you read through it, you're going to see that, as we mentioned, I think we mentioned yesterday, there's definitely a reference to the first 4 days of creation here in Job 38. But really, you look at this, and you've got quite a long chapter, and it's talking all about how God creates the earth and these weather systems and the stars. And you're kind of left at the end of it going, all right, so what we can say fairly is that on that literal layer, we can say that what this is stating here in Job 38 is that our God is the supreme creator. And absolutely that is a truth. And we can read it on that surface layer. He is the supreme creator. And this is an excellent chapter for establishing that. But is there anything more to this? Does it get into salvation critical issues? Is there anything moral in its implication? Does it reveal anything to us about the character of God himself? And that's what we want to explore. We want to go a little bit deeper than that surface layer. As true as that layer is, we're not taking away from it at all. We want to look at some of the metaphors that are used here and what is God really revealing about the type of individual that our God is. Now, in order to appreciate this, we want to start back in some of the words of Elihu from back in chapter 37. So I'm just going to throw them up here on the screen, and we're going to use a few different translations here. But it's interesting to note how it is that God chooses to represent himself. We're going to see that it's very similar in how he chooses to show himself to Israel at Mount Horeb on Sinai. And in many ways, very different than how he chooses to reveal himself to Elijah in a still small voice. So let's just go through this. In chapter 37, we have this storm that is developing, and God brings in this storm and approaches near in this storm to Job. And Elihu, as it were, introduces God coming to Job. So what are some of the elements we have? In chapter 37, verse 2 and 3, the NASB says this: listen closely to the thunder of his voice. Is this a still small voice? This is the thunder of God's voice. You just imagine if you're in a really big storm and you hear that booming of the thunder on the horizon. That's what's starting here in the beginnings of 37. The voice of God thundering, the rumbling that goes out from his mouth. Under the whole heaven, he lets it loose and is lightning to the ends of the earth. So you just kind of get a picture of what's being developed here in Job 37. Later on in verse 9, it says this: from its chambers comes the whirlwind. Now that's the ESV, much different than the King James. If you go back to in your King James, if you've got that, in 37 and verse 9, it says, out of the south cometh the whirlwind, and cold out of the north. Now that word for south is actually a word that in almost every other place is translated as chambers or bed chambers. And so other translations, such as the ESV, actually says instead of it's coming from the south, it's actually from its chambers, from its bed chambers, comes the whirlwind. This is significant to note because when you come down to verse 22 of 37, where is this storm coming from? It's not coming from the south. This is the NIV in this case, but verse 22, out of the north he comes with golden splendor. So what we have is we have the storm that is building to the north with great clouds. We've got thunder, we've got lightning, and it's coming from the north down towards where Job is. In verse 11, it says, he loads the clouds with moisture. He scatters his lightning through them. Again, the emphasis on clouds and lightnings. As we're going through this, just think in your mind, where else do we have a storm coming out of the north with all of these elements to it? Verse 18, can you join him in spreading out the skies hard as a mirror of cast bronze? That's the NIV there, but it gives this idea of he spreads out the sky as hard as a mirror of cast bronze. Perhaps this was given in the evening, and as the storm approaches, it has not yet hit them yet, and there's like this golden sunset, as it were. It's almost the sense that you're giving of this hard cast bronze on the underbelly of this approaching storm. In verse 21, you have, now the people cannot look at the light when it is bright in the skies. Interesting, that's the Amplified Bible. And then Yahweh answers Job out of this whirlwind. Now, I haven't actually been in a tornado yet. Yes. And I have a picture on my phone of a tornado right behind our house. and I'll show it to you afterwards. And I was at kids camp, so I missed it. But everything I've heard from people who have been through tornadoes is that it usually sounds like a roaring freight train, because you've got these winds swirling at these high speeds. That's how God presented himself to Job. You would not have heard a whisper from the middle of the whirlwind. What you heard was God thundering in his voice. And so God thunders to Job out of the whirlwind. What are we seeing here? This is how God presented himself to Israel at Sinai. Remember yesterday, we talked about the fact that this book is given just before that Israel is delivered out of Egypt, just before the law is given at Sinai. Can you imagine the perceptive Israelite, if aware of the story of Job, when they saw the thunder, the lightning, the clouds, the light that took place on Mount Horeb, for them, their mind would go back to Job 37 and 38. Now, that is not the only other place where we see this kind of an idea. Job's a priest. Remember that? We talked about that yesterday. He offers sacrifices in chapter 1. In chapter 42, he offers sacrifices. He is a priest of the Most High God, of El Shaddai. About 1,000 years after this story takes place, God reveals himself to another priest, Ezekiel the priest, in Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 4. And I've got it on the screen. I've just broken each of the phrases down and put them on the screen, and beside it, we've put the descriptive phrases from Job 37 and 38. In Ezekiel 1, verse 4, it was a whirlwind that appeared to Ezekiel, the priest. In Job 38, verse 1, God presents himself to Job, the priest, out of the whirlwind, same word. In both cases, it came out of the north, Ezekiel 1 verse 4, just like we saw in Job 37 verse 22, it's out of the north that the storm comes. In Ezekiel 1 verse 4, it emphasizes that there was a great cloud involved. At least half a dozen times in in Job 36 and 37, you have reference to the clouds. In Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 4, it says in the NIV, with flashing lightning. And in Job 37 verse 3, it says he unleashes his lightning. There's flashing lightning. In Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 4, and there was a bright light around it. In the NASB, it puts it that way. And in Job 37 verse 21, the Amplified Bible, and now people cannot look at the light. There is a bright light in both places. In Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 4, it says something like glowing metal, amber-colored it implies, in the midst of it. And so this whirlwind that comes out of the north to the priest Ezekiel 1,000 years later, it has this glowing amber color that's in the midst of this storm. In Job 37, verse 18, as the NIV put it, the skies are hard as a mirror of cast bronze, the same sort of idea. Isn't this interesting that, God chooses to reveal himself in different ways at different times to individuals, but it's consistent between Ezekiel 1 and Job 37 and 38. But there is a contrast. We've looked at the comparisons, but what's the contrast? Well, in Ezekiel, there is great emphasis placed on the cherubim that is there in the midst of that whirlwind. And that cherubim, it has burnished brass, makes up part of it. It is flesh purified. That's what the cherubim represents in Ezekiel chapter 1. It is all about how God will be revealed in the cherubic glory, which is you and I in the future. And so we see in Ezekiel, it emphasizes the lion, the ox, the man, and the eagle faces that are in this whirlwind. It emphasizes the cherubim. But in Job, it gives all of the other background, but it excludes the cherubim from being in this whirlwind. What is interesting is as we continue through the answer that God gives in 38, 39, 40, we find that there is a lion that God draws our attention to. That's in 38 verse 39. It is an ignorant and wild lion. It has not been purified. There is an ox in 39 and verse 9. This is a wild ox, not a tamed ox. It has not been brought into subjection or converted. There is an eagle in chapter 39, verse 27. As we shall see tomorrow, Lord willing, it is an eagle that is wild, untamed, and malicious in its intents. It has not been purified. There is a man that is spoken of in Job 40, verse 15 specifically, when it speaks of Job himself. But remember, as we saw yesterday, Job is not yet perfected. This is the education of Job that is taking place here in this book. He is like these wild animals. He is yet unperfected, untamed. There's still something wild in Job. They're all wild, untamed, and unperfected. The book of Job is revealing to us the development process of the cherubic glory. That's the contrast. Whereas in Ezekiel, it's revealing the perfected cherubic glory. So when, right off the bat, even before God even says anything to Job, our attention is brought to this idea of God revealing or manifesting himself. And as we go through the answer to Job, we realize that he is manifesting himself with the intention of perfecting a multitude of individuals who will then one day be perfected and will be revealed in the cherubim, as it was revealed in Ezekiel chapter 1. So I thought for myself, that was just a really interesting connection that kind of introduces us to this answer that God gives. Now, when we just take a big picture look at these chapters in Job, when God answers, it's interesting that God patterns his answer off of Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3 with creation and fall. So, for example, what we just read today, you'll see that chapter 38 references the first 4 days of creation. So this is all as brethren will say, this is the inanimate aspects of creation. So you've got the creation of earth, the sea versus dry land, you have light, you have weather systems, and you have stars that are mentioned. So that's what 38 is about. 39, God then references the 5th and 6th days of creation. And he introduces to us the animate side of his creation. You got the creation of different beasts and different fowls or birds, the animate side of his creation. And then in chapters 40 and 41, it makes reference to the fall, as we refer to it in Genesis chapter 3. Because in 40 and 41, it depicts the sinful state of man in 2 wild beasts. And so we will get there eventually, Lord willing. And also, oh no, good. I was looking at the minute hand versus the hour hand. I have more time than I thought. That's good. Because we haven't even gotten to 38, have we? All right, so that's where we're going with this answer that God gives. Is when God answers Job and says, this is how I will develop my moral glory in a multitude. Let's go back to Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. All right, so let's go back there. Remember, when we're there, we're looking at what is God's plan of salvation. What we're going to find is that God can and will do what man cannot do. This is kind of like the gospel of God unto salvation that's spoken of in Romans, in that it is only God that does the saving. Even, in Romans chapter 9, it says, it's not of him that willeth, nor of him that runneth, but of God's mercies. In other words, no matter how much I want to convert you, or my own children, no matter how much I want to save them, no matter how much I work to save them, it is only of God's mercies. This is the gospel of God unto salvation. I can't save myself, and I cannot save you. We're going to find that that's going to be one of the things that is emphasized here in Job. It is that God brings forgiveness and reconciliation to the story of Job. Remember, we saw yesterday in Job 31, this idea of forgiveness and grace was absent from Job's mind. We see that in, when the words of Job were ended, his last speech there in 31. But God turns that around and he brings forgiveness. And it can only happen when there's a recognition of a need for forgiveness. And so we have, this salvation is based on a developed understanding or enlightenment of God's purpose and how he works within his creation. Hence why we have these chapters are pretty fundamental as to how God will work to save man. All right, so let's go through some of the nitty-gritties here in Job 38. And I almost don't want to say this because I don't want to scare you. So don't get scared about it. You'll get this. But I did find for myself that I got like the metaphor behind 39. I was like, oh, I got this. This is great. Like, I understand what 39 is about. And then 40 and 41, lots of brethren have talked about how the Behemoth and Leviathan, you should look. And the brethren will talk about how it represents either pride or sin or something along those lines. See, yeah, okay, there's a metaphor there. They go, okay, why is it that we can see the metaphor in 39, 40, and 41, that this isn't just like some natural history type documentary that God is giving about how he's the supreme creator? I mean, that's the surface level, really important level, but there is obviously more to it. It's about how God works with man and how he deals with sin and will address sin in our lives. So when you come to 38, what's it really talking about on the deeper levels? And I had to scratch my head, and it took a while to I believe, figure out what the messages of Job 38 are. What I believe we need to do in Job 38 to really appreciate it is to understand that when God goes back and references the first 4 days of creation, he's doing it to show that he is a consistent God. He reveals things about his character, about who he was. And our God is so consistent in the way he is that it will show in all his works. So, for example, let's just read through this section here, the first part about verses 4 through to 6. Here God says to Job, he says, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone?" Okay, so you just kind of sit back and you think, okay, what is God really saying here in this passage? And I think what you will probably end up concluding is that God is revealing something about his character. And that is that God created the earth with a purpose. It wasn't created in vain. It was not an empty creation. It was formed to be inhabited. This tells us that our God is a God of purpose. And being a God of purpose, that means that he is going to have a plan to achieve that purpose. And when he sets out as the grand architect this plan to achieve his purpose, it means that he will have to lay foundations. So what we're seeing, this might be useful to write into the margin of your Bible, is that this reveals in verses 4 to 6 the character of God. He is the grand architect, one who has purpose, who has a plan, and who lays foundations. Let's just reread that. See if you see this. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? He lays foundations. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? Why do you mark out in construction? Why do you mark it out and measure it out? Because you've got a blueprint you need to follow. That's why you're measuring it out. That's the plan. On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone? You've got all this emphasis to this cornerstone, this foundation. There's a plan. We have a God of purpose. Now, do you remember Job's first speech? Yeah. Back to Job, chapters 3 and 4. Remember how he laments through that speech. I wish I had never been born. I wish I was a stillborn child. Do you remember that? Yeah. What's Job's problem? He had lost purpose in life. He was not living with purpose. He wished he was dead. And that begins the decline of Job. What reveals it eventually, by the time you get to the end of his speeches, it reveals that you've got some problems with your doctrinal understanding of God, his nature, and his purpose. We must remember, brothers and sisters, that our God is a God of purpose, that he's created the earth not in vain. All right, now, as soon as I start going like this and looking at this, I'm going, wait a second. This, yes, is saying that he is a supreme creator, but it tells me something about who our God is. Now, I'm just going to insert in there, and I guess it's already there because of our what our title is for this class. But you see, God's purpose didn't end in Genesis chapter 1 when he created the heavens and the earth. Was he just creating the earth for the sake of having a globe with inhabitants on it? No, his purpose ultimately is for a spiritual creation to be developed. So what we're going to find by the end of this is that what he's revealing is that the principles he operated on in Genesis chapter 1 are the same principles that we must operate on in life. So if I was to create a list of things that I should remind myself of on a regular basis, I thought it's funny you have good intentions, they don't fulfill them. That's me quite often. If I had a bright orange piece of paper beside my bed in Sharpie, I could write on it so that I see first thing in the morning, live with purpose. And I think that would be something, if I could remind myself of the purpose that I am here on earth, that would be the best way for me to start my day. Now, what would be the next thing that God would choose to reveal about himself and who he is? For now, we're just going to pass over verse 7. We will definitely get to it in our last class, but let's go to the next main section, which is in verses 8 to 11. So in verses 8 to 11, and just to give you all the answers, what we're going to see is that this reveals about God that he exercises restraint. Specifically, he works to restrain sin. We're going to see that in verses 8 to 11. So let's just read this together, verses 8 to 11. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness. We just got to stop for a moment because, we talk about El Shaddai. It's likely that the term Shaddai both implies a nurturer as well as a destroyer. The word for Shaddai can be related to Shad, which is the breast, which is where you get the feminine aspect of any mammal or human, who would then nurture a child. So that's where Shaddai comes from, that Shad, or the breast. It could also be coming from Shadad, which is, again, the same part of the body, but on a man, which is a place of core strength. And you get a warrior who will go forth and who will destroy the enemy and protect the family. How does God present himself? Most often in Scripture, it's in the masculine form, but he presents himself almost in a mothering way here. It's interesting. He talks about the sea. Who is the one who controlled the sea? Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds as garments and wrapped it in thick darkness. It's almost like a monster had been born by the seas. And it's like God comes in and he takes control of that particular, monster of the seas. He wraps it in thick darkness. When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place. You see how doors have come up several times. Why do you have doors? Well, a door is either to keep things in or to keep things out. Do you get the idea of setting up bars along with the doors? This is a fortification that our God has put in place. Why would you have fortification? Barred doors. It is to firmly restrain. And then look at this. When I said, this far you may come and no further. So he sets a limit. And he says, here is where your proud waves halt. I mean, you're probably familiar that in Scripture, oftentimes, you'll have the seas represent the nations. And when they have waves and they're not clear as glass, then what you have is you have a storm upon the nations, the raging and the roaring of the multitudes who are in ignorance and darkness, who are going to fight against the Lord's anointed. And this talks about the proud waves. What is God doing in verses 8 to 11? He's restraining them. He created the earth with purpose. We saw that in verses 4 through to 6. But then in that purpose, there is going to be the problem of sin. And so he immediately sets restraints for sin. He has a plan of salvation. So that's what this, I believe anyways, that's what this reveals to us about the character of God, to exercise restraint, to restrain specifically sin. Now, going back to that that good intention I have of having that bright orange piece of paper beside my bed. I start off my days reminding myself of, are you living with purpose, Nathan? Now, if I'm living with purpose, that means that wherewithal shall the young man cleanse his ways. It necessitates that there would be a restraining of sin in my life. So not only am I seeing that this reveals the character of our God, but if I am going to be part of a spiritual creation, I will live by this principle of restraining sin in my life. And if I can, influencing you to restrain sin as well. All right, but let's go to the next main kind of group of thoughts that comes up here. Well, verses 12 to 15 is talking about light. Okay, as soon as I mention light, I'm sure many of you are going, wait a second, light in the Bible? 1 John chapter 1, walking in light versus walking in darkness. That's a pretty fair thing to consider when we're talking about light. What does God say about light? So he wants to emphasize this to us. This is the third point of emphasis that God says. Verses 12 to 15. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? Is this just talking about the creation of light? There's something a little bit deeper, isn't it? It's about wickedness being exposed. How is wickedness exposed? It's exposed by the light of the truth. That light coming in and cutting through the ignorance of the darkness of this world and shining into our hearts so that we can become the light of the world. We keep reading through it. The earth takes shape like clay under a seal. Its features stand out like those of a garment. And I tried to depict on this picture here what we're looking at. You get this idea of the sun rising. This is the early dawn upon a dark world. And before the sun came up, you're looking out there and it's just all black and dark. You are ignorant of the shapes that lie there before you. You just don't know what it is that you're looking at. But gradually, as the light increases, the earth takes shape like clay under a seal. And if I had a seal, like a ring with a seal on it, and if I had a piece of clay and I was to press into that clay, you would begin to see the formation of all the rises and falls in that clay. What happens is in the morning when the sun rises, you can start to see the hills and the valleys. That's the poetic language, as I believe it's saying here. The earth takes shape like clay under a seal. What is the light doing? It's revealing what there is. It is shining through ignorance to expose. Its features start to stand out like those of a garment. Now you can see the details of the garment. You can see the warp and the weft. You can see the way that the garment is made as the light brightens. And then again, look at this. The last verse, the wicked, back to this idea of the wicked are denied their light. What are they associated with in Job? The wicked are associated with the darkness, living in the shadows. They're denied their light. Their upraised arm is broken. This is the fist of defiance is broken by the light of truth. This isn't hands lifted in prayer. This is the upraised arm of defiance being broken. How are you going to ever break defiance? God breaks it using his light. That's what this is saying. Their upraised arm, their defiance is broken by the light. So again, we ask ourselves, yes, God is the supreme creator. What is this revealing about who God is? He is a God who exists in light, who dwells in light unapproachable. Everything he does has to do with light. And guess what the new spiritual creation? We ought to walk in light. So anyways, as I start going through this, I can't help but marvel at the fact that, wow, this is starting to make sense. This reveals something that is actually impactful to my understanding of who God is and who I will need to become. All right, but let's carry on through here. Now, this part I struggled with the most in all of Job 38, kind of thinking, okay, so what is the message that's contained here? So I think that this is the answer. And I think that what this is containing in verses 16 to 21 is that God is the source of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. Now, that's an important thing for you and I to accept, is that there is no other source of wisdom, knowledge, or understanding in this world. And it's so tempting for us to turn into the philosophers, to the self-help books, and to all those sorts of things. And yes, they may say good things now and again, but that does not mean that they are a source of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. Now, let's just see as you read through this, and you can tell me afterwards if you have a better explanation for this. But when I read through verses 16 to 21, look what it's saying. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea? What are the springs of the sea? It's the sources of the sea. Have you walked in the recesses of the deep? So, supposedly man knows less about what's in the bottom of our oceans than we know about what's on the surface of the moon. At least that's what, scientists like to say about our ignorance. And hey, here's God saying to Job, have you walked in the recesses of the deep? It's an area that is completely unknown to man. And I've been there, Job. I've walked in the recesses of the deep. In fact, I could tell you what the source of the sea is, how that hydrogen and oxygen was combined once upon a time, thousands of years ago for us, and it formed the seas. I can tell you all those details, but can you, Job? Man cannot tell you these things. He goes on, have the gates of death been shown to you? Now, all right, but what are gates used for? Well, they're like bars and doors. A gate is used to keep things in or to keep things out. And so what would the gates of death be talking about? Well, it's talking about mortality. It's also talking about the concept of resurrection. That reminds me of when Christ in Revelation, he says, I close and no man opens, and I open and no man closes. What is he saying? It is only the Lord Jesus Christ who will be able to close the doors to eternal or to everlasting life. And it is only the Lord Jesus Christ who will be able to open that door and to invite individuals in. And so it's just interesting that you have this reference already to the idea of mortality and resurrection. Well, have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? And again, we're talking now about access. We're talking about source in verse 16. Verse 17 is talking about access to things that we do not have any control over. The next verse, have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. Can you measure the earth in a balance, as it were? And yet, God has measured the earth in a balance. He has weighed it in his scales. What is the way to the abode of light? And where does darkness reside? Nowadays, scientists are still trying to understand what is dark energy and what is dark matter that makes up, I think they say it's like 70% of our universe, or at least they suggest that that's what it is. And we're still asking science is still asking these questions. Where does darkness reside? God's saying, I know all those answers, Joe. But man struggles with every single one of these concepts. What is the way to the abode of light? Even with light and the idea, the concept of light speed and light waves, or is it particles or is it waves? And what is the speed of light? Is it a consistent speed there and back, or is it half the speed when it reflects and comes back? You can get into all these weird and wonderful arguments if you're into science, but man still struggles just to know what light is. And yet we see it every single day. Can you take them to their places? Do you know the paths to their dwellings, light and darkness, their source? Surely you know, God says, for you are already born. You have lived so many years. What is God doing? He's challenging Job. Job, with all your wisdom, with all your righteousness, do you know these answers, these basic answers about the earth and light and the sea? Do you know that? And you're left dumbfounded. Man, in all his wisdom, knows nothing in comparison to the Father. What I think God is emphasizing is he is saying here that God is the source of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. No matter how old we are, how educated we are, how intelligent we are, we will never gain this wisdom, knowledge, and understanding without God. And that's the importance as we go through this list of things that I must live by in my life. Who is your authority? When you seek for wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, who do you go to? There's only one true source of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. All right, well, let's go on to the next one. Okay, so verses 22 to 30 is a fairly long section. This is when we start talking about the weather systems. So again, as I have at the bottom of the screen, what does it reveal about our God? About who he is? Essentially what it's saying is that the word as a nurturer and a destroyer, because the word is also used to judge. Christ says that the word will judge him in the last day, but the word also rains down from heaven and brings forth life as well. So the word as a nurturer and destroyer, it brings results out of desolation. So before we read this section, let's just go to Isaiah 55. So keep your place, obviously, in Job. And Isaiah 55 talks about this kind of concept. And when we go through this, what comparison, what metaphor does God use to describe how he is going to bring results out of desolation? Well, Isaiah 55, verse 10. Verse 8 or 9, for starters. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith Yahweh. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Sounds a lot like what we've already been considering in Job. Now look verse 10. For as the rain cometh down, and the snow from heaven, and returneth not thither, but watereth the earth, and maketh it bring forth and bud, that it may give seed to the sower and bread to the eater. What's he going to say in the next verse? He says, that's all a parable. When the rain comes down and produces fruit, it's a parable. What's the parable of creation? Verse 11, so shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. When I create a spiritual creation, it's going to be like the rain or the snow that comes down from heaven, and it will produce fruit. Verse 11 of Isaiah 55, so shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, because of course I'm a God with purpose, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereto I sent it. Now with that in mind, let's go back to Job 38 and that somewhat long section in verses 22 through to 30. Do you see these concepts? God says to Job, have you entered into the storehouses of the snow or seen the storehouses of the hail? And yes, this is poetic language, but if you can just kind of get past the difficulty that may put to it, especially if you're not into poetry, like some of you might be into poetry. What we're saying is this is talking about the sources and the beginnings of snow and hail. And note this, which I reserve for times of trouble, for days of great war and battle. See, the word of God, it will bring forth fruit for his purpose. But in that process, that word will also be a judge. It's reserved for times of troubles, for days of war and battle. That's what I have down here. This is revealing that the word is both a nurturer and a destroyer. We carry on through these verses. What is the way to the place where the lightning is dispersed, or the place where the east winds are scattered over the earth? Okay, well, what's that saying? It's saying, where's the source of your rain clouds? You know, that rain that rains on the earth and brings forth fruit in a desert land. What's the source of that? Well, man is definitely not the source of that. But I am, God is saying. And in God's provision, look at this, who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain. That's why when it talks in the previous verse about the lightnings and the east winds, it's talking about the building of storms, because it cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm. For what purpose? Isaiah 55, verse 10 and 11. To water a land, it's desolate, where no one lives, where there was previously, it was void with no purpose. Upon an uninhabited desert, so that it will satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass. If God had no purpose with the earth would be a desert. There would be no rain raining down. If God had no purpose with the earth, he would not have revealed his word to us in this book, the Bible, and in the life of his Son, and there would be no fruit, no Psalm 1, the godly man who brings forth his fruit in his season, that living tree. There will be none of that. But God has a purpose with the earth, and he will bring forth a product and fruit. And he says, does the rain have a father? Who fathers the drops of dew? Now here is God presenting himself. I am the Father. I am the Father that brings the rain and the dew. And then he switches in the next verse. From whose womb comes the ice? Who gives birth to the frost from the heavens? And now he switches to the mother aspect, as if he brings forth and bears this creation. What is he saying? He's saying, actually, a parent, Job. Job, you said that I was as a lion pursuing its prey. If you ever watch some of those documentaries, what lions do to their prey, they tear them apart. They destroy them. They kill them. They suffocate them. They eat them when they're still alive if they're that hungry. God's saying, I'm a parent to you. I'm as both a father and as a mother. I created the earth with purpose, and I will provide for it. When the waters become hard as stone, when the surface of the deep is frozen, it goes on to speak of this idea of ice and frost and again, I guess you say this last bit, emphasizing the ice. Now, in our last class, we want to come back to this idea because there's definitely not just the idea of God as a nurturer here. There is the idea of nurturing. You see that in this chunk in the middle here, where you have him bringing rain upon a desolate land so it can bring forth fruit. You definitely have the idea of judgment, because remember, you have the storehouses of hail reserved for times of trouble, for days of war and battle. All right, so that's how I've summarized this. The word is both a nurturer and a destroyer, and it brings results out of desolation. But the more I become in tune with the word of God, the more I must recognize that I must exercise both nurture and judgment. I can't be the kind of brother who only focuses on nurture or who only focuses on judgment. I, like the Heavenly Father who I seek to manifest, I must seek to manifest both of those qualities in my life. All right, let's go on to the next one. This is interesting. He then looks at the heavens. Okay, what does this tell us about God? Well, again, of course, he's the supreme creator. It says this, can you bind the chains of Pleiades or loosen Orion's belts? So that's obviously speaking about the different constellations. Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons or lead out the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? Or their rule over the earth, the NASB says. Now, absolutely, God is the great creator, the supreme creator who created the heavens in their vastness. Absolutely. But isn't it interesting, the like binding the heavens, loosening the heavens, bringing forth, that's like to lead the heavens, establishing laws in the heavens, God's dominion over the earth. What do the heavens commonly represent in Scripture? It's the ruling powers. What is this saying? It's saying that God possesses dominion over the kingdom of men. He's the one that binds and loosens, that leads them forth. God rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will. Interesting, the idea of dominion is something that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. We were created with a purpose that we might have dominion. All right, well, let's just carry on. For time's sake, we'll just kind of zip through to the next one. This is the last section here. Job 38, verse 34 to 41, I believe what it's revealing to us is specifically the fact that our God provides for those who are in need. See if you see that when you go through this. Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself in the flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you saying, here we are? Who gives the ibis wisdom or gives the rooster understanding? Who has the wisdom to count the clouds? Who can tip over the water jars of the heavens? So here's the heavens earlier on, And they're saying, okay, we're ready. Whenever you give the command, we will go out and we'll dump rain on the earth. And here you have it. Who has the wisdom to count the clouds, and who takes those clouds and tips over the water jars of the heavens when the dust becomes hard and the clods of the earth stick together? What's God saying? Who does that, Job? Who is the provider, Job? You're not the provider, Job. I'm the provider, he's saying. Do you have to pray for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in a thicket? What's a lion? It's a wild, untamed creature. It's an unclean creature. And even for those creatures, God has provided in their season what they need. At the end, who provides food for the raven? Again, an unclean creature. When its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food. Can you provide for the nations, Job? Can you provide for this world? How many soup kitchens are you going to be able to hold, Job? The answer is, you will not solve the world's problems. But I can, as the great provider. But you see, in all this, there is a lesson for us. So let's just review through so we can see where we've been. I've been trying to bring out both how God's character is manifested as well as the lessons, how they apply to us. But what are we really seeing in Job 38? We're seeing who our God is. Yes, he's a supreme creator, but look at these things. He's one who has plan, purpose, and preparation to fulfill that plan. He is one who will go and restrain and limit sin. He is one who exists in light. He alone is a source of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. He is the one who will both nourish and destroy in its season. He is the one who possesses dominion over the earth, and he expects us to gradually build up and possess dominion, to keep ourselves in subjection. He is the one who provides. And the question is, brothers and sisters, what about you and I? You know, this goes back to those basic first principles. And for time's sake, we're not going to review it too much, but Numbers 14:21, what's God's purpose with the earth? Was it just to create the earth in Genesis 1? No, it's to create his moral glory that it will fill the earth. And so when the glory is proclaimed to Moses, it's, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. I'll show mercy to whom I will show mercy. In other words, I will save who I want, when I want, and how I want, is what God is saying. And he has that plan of salvation. And when we look at who our God is, we see for us what God is looking to develop. And I suggest that if we want to be part of this spiritual creation, the new creation, that as is spoken of as the new Jerusalem, if we want to be part of it, we need to live according to these principles, to live with plan, purpose, and preparation. To not lose sight. Do not lose sight of that vision, that joy, that hope that is set before us. We must learn to restrain and to limit sin in our lives. There's so many verses for all of these things. Psalm 119, verses 1-3, blessed are the undefiled in the way, who walk in the law of Yahweh. And you can carry on through that. They're individuals who walk in light. They love light, not darkness. And they walk in light. Light is where the source of wisdom. And you just go through Proverbs 1. Knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. It can only come from God. But do we seek elsewhere for our sources? We must be individuals who display the character of God, both mercy and judgment, in his various forms, the character of God. This is a maturing of our understanding of who God is and how that applies in how we work it out. We are individuals who ought to have dominion, to bring into subjection sin in our own life. As we shall see in the next two chapters, you can't do it on your own. And ultimately, brothers and sisters, the Son of Man came not to be ministered, but to minister and to give his life as a ransom for many. So how much more ought we to minister to those who are in need? You see, brothers and sisters, if we can learn to live according to these principles, then we can become part of that cherubim when it's perfected and in glory. But for now, we are in the mortal stage. We're in the perfecting state. We are the untamed and yet wild man that God is working with. And hopefully, tomorrow we can begin to consider how God will manifest himself and work with even men and women like you and me, despite our faults. Thank you.